Welcome to the Culinary Time Machine. We are going to explore the history of food and the evolution of cooking. In this show, we are going to look at what factors led to the invention, discovery of cooking, how cooking has impacted our culture and our history, and the history of civilization, and how food and humans co-evolved together. And this show is all about curiosity. I do have a deep appreciation for the scientific method and a very scholarly approach. However, I am not your expert in scholarly approaches to the history of food or evolution. I am a chef. I love food. I love cooking. I love cooking for others. And so my expertise very much comes from the flavor, texture, cooking technique side, not the anthropological, archaeological, scholarly side. So just keep that in mind, because you should not be quoting my show in your next thesis by any means. This show is really about curiosity and looking at this very complex history of cooking and food from a more individual perspective when and where we can. When you look at a lot of published texts out there, they discuss this topic in a very broad, general term in large populations over hundreds and hundreds of thousands of years. Because, yes, of course, we don't have the evidence to tell us what an individual person 1.5 million years ago was experiencing in their food. So my goal is to take some of that research and referencing some of these evidence-based, discoveries and things, while also asking some unique questions about, well, what would it have looked like to have, put ourselves in the feet of people hundreds and hundreds of thousands of years ago, and think about experiences with food and cooking from that perspective. These are perspectives that we just really don't have much tangible evidence about. So it's going to be a lot of curiosity, a lot of wondering, a lot of, could it be that this is how it was? I'm not positioning myself as like the expert in this and that I know what happened 2 million years ago, what people were thinking by any means. That I am not that type of expert. I am just here because I have a fascination in where did cooking come from? How did cooking evolve? How did humans evolve with food? And I thought maybe some of you would be interested in that too. So I'm going to, yes, do some research and tell you what, I've discovered in my research, while also doing my own thought experiments about what I think could have been. And I would love for you all to join me on this journey and join me in the comments. Let me know what thoughts you have. If there's anything that I say that creates an aha moment for you, or that helps you connect two ideas, or if you just already have a strong foundation of ideas. And if you know anybody who you think would also be fascinated by this topic, please share this with them and encourage them to also go down to the comments and let me know what their expertise is, because I know that there are so many people out there who are going to have the much more scholarly, scientifically researched expertise that I do not have. And I would love to talk to them and, learn about what they know. I'm so curious in this subject because, the way that humans evolved sometimes is explained in a very oversimplified way, like, all right, we were chimps, and then we're humans, and fire, and then cities, and now here we are. Like, ta-da! And 2, 4, 5, 6 million years doesn't just break down to like 4 or 5 steps, right? And so in a similar way, I think that the human relationship with food is also oftentimes very oversimplified. We evolve into humans as hunter-gatherers, and then we discover fire, and then we all become farmers, and then we build cities, and then we figure out, oh, we can genetically modify crops in a lab, and here we are today, right? That's super oversimplified. And what I'm really curious about is what happens during all of those and thens, right? Hunter-gatherer, and then there's fire. And it's not a stair-step sequence of one thing ends and the next thing begins, right? There is all kinds of layers. We're really going to be like an onion peeling back the layers of how some opportunistic actions and how some habitual actions, led to where we are today, and really being curious about what all came together to progress humans and humans' love of food and humans' relationship with food and cooking. And the way in which I discuss these opportunistic actions versus these habitual actions in this show is probably going to be pretty different from how they are looked at from the scientific world. Totally makes sense, because typically any archaeological evidence that we find is going to link to habitual actions, because it's much more likely that there will be physical evidence of something that happened many, many, many times. Whereas in an opportunistic action, there may or may not be any type of physical evidence of that actually ever taking place. For example, if you think about how a human encountered fire, long before humans could control fire and decide when they wanted to stir up a campfire, there were still wildfires happening. So a human could have gone into an area that had very recently been burned by a wildfire, and maybe they just killed a small animal and they could cook that animal over some coals. Well, that could have happened thousands and thousands of generations before there's any evidence of humans harnessing fire. That opportunistic action may or may not have ever happened again in that person's lifetime, and they may or may not have had the language to communicate that and share that learning with other people. So from a scholarly standpoint, we kind of need habitual actions to build up the evidence to make it likely that we're going to uncover it at some random point, as we're digging in an archaeological dig or something. We need to find that evidence, and so habitual actions are going to be much more likely to create that evidence. But it doesn't mean that opportunistic actions never happened. So as I'm curious about this subject and asking these questions, there are going to be many times where I'm asking, could an opportunistic event have happened that could have predated any sort of physical evidence that we have to show that that action, had become a habit for people? What kind of opportunistic things are we missing over how many generations? Another difference is going to be that in a lot of more scholarly, well-researched texts and things, they do speak about populations and the diets of populations over many, many people over hundreds of thousands of years. Again, totally makes sense for the way that the scientific method works. And if you look at large numbers of people over a very long amount of time, you can see those trends and those patterns prove themselves over time. So a lot of times when you hear about the diet of a population, it is really a macro look, and the individual person may have never in their lifetime seen the type of variety that this population of people experienced. In general, if a large population is going to be eating more nutrient-dense meals throughout lifetimes, throughout generation after generation after generation, then you're going to see that that population is going to then be able to support higher numbers of a population, right? More nutrient-dense foods means we can procreate more, and more will survive to procreate again for the next generation. More macro outlook. And more nutrient-dense foods also, and better digestion also means you can grow bigger brains. And that doesn't happen from one lifetime to the next in a perceptible means, right? It is the tiny little evolutionary gains over hundreds and hundreds and thousands of generations where you can really see that difference. So while that is absolutely something that, I'll be considering as I get curious and ask and dive into these topics, I am also curious to know, okay, like an individual person, if their average lifespan encompassed like 5 miles, well, you can say that this population of people maybe ate 8 different fish, but this one person may have only had 2 types of fish their entire life. Or maybe not, who knows? Right? Even if the most common source of nutrition was cassava, doesn't mean that this person may not have discovered some other fruits and vegetables that we today may have no idea ever existed. And so I believe that individual choice is very important, even though it's really hard to truly research and find evidence of individuals' choices. You can really only theorize and dream about what they may have been. But you're going to see an evolution of humans based off of the nutrient density of foods, but it doesn't necessarily mean that each person, every time they were eating a meal, they were thinking well, I'm gonna get the most nutrient dense item. The food I'm going to eat is the most nutrient dense, that's the thing that I am prioritizing. They had taste buds too. Actually, the majority of vertebrates can taste the 5 basic tastes: sweet, salty, sour, umami, and bitter. So, actually, side note, some carnivores can no longer taste sweet. They've evolved out of tasting sweet, like felines and dolphins and hyenas. But the point is, human beings, from before we were even human beings, we had taste buds. And there has to be some universal pleasurable experience in tasting something that we enjoy. And having the mental capacity to say I enjoyed the flavor and the texture of this over that. And I'm so interested to figure out how that shaped our trajectory as a human race. In my opinion, there are these universal truths about desire and pleasure in humans, and food could have been one of our first experiences with that discretion between what brought us more pleasure and what didn't. And also, people's specific preferences, I would imagine, had to have guided the choices that they made in either where they went to look for more food or the types of foods that they ate more or less of. Pursuing those preferences would have shaped a person's behavior. That's just me explaining the premise of this show. In the first episode, I'm going to talk about what factors led to the discovery of cooking. I'm still trying to decide if I consider it a discovery of cooking or an invention of cooking. But episode 1 will be what factors led to that. Episode 2 will be the benefits of cooking on human evolution, civilization, and then we'll go into how food impacts conflict, how humans and foods have co-evolved, how styles of cooking have evolved over time, the spice trade's impact on history, the evolution of restaurants, and lastly, how culture and food are inseparable. So the last thing I want to introduce to you before I shoot you on over to the first episode is this timeline, because I don't know about you, but whenever we start talking about hundreds of thousands or even millions of years, my brain has such a hard time really grasping how large of a length of time that is, right? We live around 80 to 100-ish years, so 20 years can feel like a really long time to us. Even sometimes like a week feels like a long time. But realistically, 100 years, I was like, oh my gosh, 100 years. So 1,000 years is hard enough to really grasp the length of. Versus 100,000 or 1,000,000, it's just such a long period of time, and you're talking about so many generations of human beings throughout that time. So I have created my own little scale to help me wrap my mind around just how long of timelines we're talking about here. And so I am comparing it to cooking a ragu sauce with some like marinated and super slow cooked beef and some ravioli pasta dish. If this dinner takes us 6 hours to prepare from beginning to end, then each minute would be the equivalent of 6,000 years if we are talking about the time that humans began migrating from Africa into Asia. Right, so in this example, at the time that humans are migrating into Asia, this is also when we are beginning to marinate our beef. So then these 6 hours of cooking this dish are going to cover about 2 million years of human history. Now, if each minute equals 6,000 years, that means that the minute that we are plating our dish together, getting ready to eat, that minute was around the time Mesopotamia was established, which is like the well agreed upon first civilization where written human history begins. Mesopotamia in the Fertile Crescent. Yeah, that one. That's 1 minute ago. And let's just get even smaller. We're gonna say 1 second ago. That's like the sprinkling of a little bit of freshly grated Parmesan on top right before you dig into that meal. That 1 second ago, that's about when supermarkets were founded. It's about 100 years ago. Now, Piggly Wiggly claims to have started the first supermarket in 1916, and I am not going to fight Piggly Wiggly. I'm not going to. Though I have also seen and read some accounts of the first like truly modern supermarket being like founded in more like the 1930s. So call it somewhere between 1916 and 1930, and that's about 100 years ago, right? So not fighting with Piggly Wiggly, maybe it was 1916, but we're just gonna call it a nice even 100. 100 years is 1 second, that's just the garnish, and think about how much time went into that 6 hour meal preparation. And 1 second ago is like when supermarkets started. So anyway, I'm gonna be continuing to use this timeline. You will see it over and over again as I go through, you know, when some of these discoveries and things happened in our human history to give us hopefully a better point of reference to wrap our minds around just how long of time we are talking here when we talk about human evolution and humans evolving alongside food and with cooking. Well, thank you so much for watching this introduction. I hope that you are just as curious about this kind of stuff as I am. If you are, please subscribe, follow along, invite your friends. Let me know in the comments what you're super excited and curious about learning. I am so excited to have you on this culinary time machine with me as we explore the history of food and the evolution of cooking. Thank you.